The cast iron stoves of Ironwood, Dakota Territory, were devouring wood at a rate that would exhaust every stockpile in the settlement before February. The cold snap that had descended on the northern plains in the second week of January 1886 was not ordinary winter cold. It was the kind of cold that made iron stoves glow cherry red and still could not warm the rooms they occupied, that demanded constant feeding every hour or half hour, that transformed carefully stacked wood piles into ash and memory faster than anyone had believed possible. The Lindgren family, who owned the largest mercantile in Ironwood, had burned through a week's worth of wood in 2 days. The Hendersons, with 4 children under 10, were already breaking apart their furniture to supplement their dwindling supply. The Reverend Hoskins had emptied the church woodshed and was now burning the pews, reasoning that God would understand. Everyone was cold. Everyone was running out of fuel. Everyone was watching their cast iron stoves consume everything they had while giving back heat that vanished the moment the fire died down. Everyone except Auntie Korhonen. The Finnish immigrant sat in his cabin at the edge of the settlement, comfortable in shirt sleeves, reading a book by lamplight while the same brutal cold that was killing his neighbors pressed against his walls and found no entry. His stove, if it could be called that, was not glowing red. It was not roaring with flame. The fire that he had lit at dawn had burned down to coals hours ago, and yet the massive stone structure that occupied the center of his cabin continued to radiate heat as steadily as if the fire still blazed within. He had loaded it once that morning. He would not need to load it again until evening. 12 hours of constant, gentle warmth from a single firing, while his neighbors fed their hungry iron beasts every 30 minutes and still shivered in their beds. They had laughed at his stove when he built it. They had called it a monument to foreign foolishness, a waste of good stone that would never throw heat the way proper American cast iron did. They had watched him haul rocks and mix mortar and construct something that looked more like a small building than a heating device, and they had shaken their heads at the stubborn Finn, who refused to accept that Americans knew better than peasants from the frozen north. Now their cast iron stoves were eating their futures, and Auntie Korhonen's stone failure was the only thing keeping him warm. He looked out the window toward the settlement, toward the thin smoke rising from chimneys where families were feeding fires that could never be satisfied, and he made a decision. His roan gelding, Pekka, stamped in the small stable attached to the cabin, also warmed by the radiant heat of the great stone stove. They laughed, Auntie said quietly, in the Finnish his mother had taught him. But children should not freeze because their parents were proud. He began pulling on his coat. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from today, whether you're in the frozen north, the high plains, or somewhere the cold cuts through cast iron like it isn't there. These lessons of frontier wisdom are timeless. And if you haven't already, subscribe so you don't miss what happens when the stove they mocked becomes the only warmth for miles. Auntie had come to America in the spring of 1879, following a brother who had written letters about land that could be claimed for nothing more than the willingness to work it. He was 27 years old, unmarried, a stonemason's son from a village in eastern Finland, where winters lasted 8 months, and survival depended on the knowledge that his people had accumulated over 1,000 years. In Finland, no one heated their homes with cast iron boxes that ate wood like starving wolves. The Finnish people had developed something different, something called a peruni, or, in the dialect of his village, simply the stove. It was a massive construction of stone or brick built around a firebox and a series of channels that captured the heat of a fire and stored it in tons of thermal mass. You burned a hot fire for an hour or two, and then the stone itself became your heat source, radiating warmth for 12, 15, even 20 hours without additional fuel. The physics were simple, though Auntie had learned them through tradition rather than schooling. Cast iron conducted heat quickly. It got hot fast, radiated that heat into the room, and cooled just as quickly when the fire died. Stone was the opposite. It absorbed heat slowly, stored it in its mass, and released it gradually over many hours. A cast iron stove needed constant feeding to maintain temperature. A stone stove needed one good fire, and then time for the stones to do their work. His father had built such stoves for 40 years. Auntie had apprenticed beside him, learning the art of constructing fireboxes and smoke channels and the precise arrangement of mass that would capture the most heat and release it most evenly. He had helped build stoves that heated manor houses and peasant cottages alike, structures that looked like furniture or small monuments that dominated the rooms they occupied and made those rooms comfortable through the worst that Finnish winter could deliver. When he arrived in Dakota Territory, he had been astonished to find that Americans heated their homes with cast iron, small, hungry machines that burned hot and fast and demanded constant attention. The wastefulness offended him. The inefficiency seemed almost criminal in a land where firewood had to be hauled from distant forests or purchased at prices that would bankrupt a careful man. He had tried to explain, in his limited English, that there was a better way. The settlers of Ironwood had listened politely and then ignored him completely. If you're enjoying this story, hit that hype button right now. It's free, takes a second, and helps this video reach more people who need to see it. Now, back to the story. The mockery had begun in the summer of 1882, when Auntie started construction on his cabin. Most settlers built quickly. Wooden frames, simple construction, a space for the cast iron stove that every hardware merchant in the territory was eager to sell. Auntie built slowly, methodically, starting not with walls but with a foundation for something that the other settlers could not understand. "The Finn is building a castle for his stove," observed Horace Wheeler, who owned the general store and considered himself the arbiter of sensible behavior in Ironwood. "Look at him, laying stones like he's constructing a fortress. Someone should tell him that stoves come from the foundry, not the quarry." The laughter had spread through the settlement. The Finn and his stone stove. The foreigner who thought he knew better than American industry. The stubborn immigrant who was wasting his summer building a monument to old-world ignorance while sensible people constructed proper homes with proper heating. Auntie heard the mockery but did not respond to it. His English was still uncertain, and argument required fluency that he did not possess. More importantly, he knew that words would not convince people who had already decided not to understand. Only results would matter, and results would come when winter arrived. He built the stove over 3 months, hauling granite from an outcropping 10 miles distant, mixing mortar from lime he burned himself, constructing the firebox and the channels and the massive thermal mass that would store and release heat for hours after each firing. The structure, when complete, was 6 feet tall, 8 feet long, and 4 feet wide. It occupied the center of his cabin like a small monument, dominating the single room that served as his kitchen, living space, and bedroom. The firebox was lined with fire brick that he had purchased from a specialty supplier in St. Paul, one of his few concessions to American commerce. The channels that carried hot gases from the firebox through the mass of the stove were arranged in a pattern his father had perfected, a series of baffles that forced the heat to travel through as much stone as possible before exiting through the chimney. By the time the smoke reached the outside air, it was barely warm. All its heat had been absorbed by the stone. The settlers who visited his cabin in the autumn, curious despite their skepticism, had not been impressed. "It's cold," Martha Wheeler had pronounced, laying her hand on the stone surface. "Your stove is cold, Mr. Korhonen. How is a cold stove supposed to heat anything?" Auntie had tried to explain that the stove was not meant to be hot to the touch, that the warmth would be gentle and constant rather than fierce and fleeting, that the stones would radiate heat at a temperature comfortable for humans rather than one that burned the skin. His explanation, hampered by language and disbelief, had convinced no one. "The Finn stove is cold," became a joke that lasted through the autumn and into the winter. Whenever anyone wanted to illustrate foolishness, they invoked the cold stove of the stubborn immigrant who refused to accept that cast iron was the American way. If Wild West Retribution has become part of your week, consider joining the channel membership. Just a couple dollars a month keeps these stories coming. Links below, and hit that hype button if you haven't already. Now, back to the story. The first winter had vindicated Auntie's design, though no one had paid attention. While his neighbors fed their cast iron stoves every hour, Auntie fired his stone stove twice daily, once in the morning, once in the evening. He burned hot fires, the kind that would have damaged a cast iron box, letting the flames roar through the channels and heat the stone mass to its core. Then he closed the damper, let the fire die to coals, and enjoyed 12 hours of steady warmth that required no attention whatsoever. His wood consumption was perhaps 1/3 what his neighbors burned. His cabin was never cold, never hot, always comfortable, the stone releasing its stored heat at a rate that matched the rate at which the walls lost heat to the outside. The system was elegant, efficient, and completely invisible to people who had already decided that it could not work. The winters of 1883, 1884, and 1885 followed the same pattern. Auntie lived comfortably while his neighbors struggled, burned less wood while staying warmer, and watched the settlement ignore evidence that contradicted their assumptions. The joke about the cold stove continued, repeated by people who had never spent a night in his cabin, never felt the gentle warmth that radiated from stone that held hours of heat in its mass. Then came January 1886. The cold that descended on Dakota Territory in the second week of that month was unlike anything the settlers had experienced. Temperatures dropped to 40 below zero and stayed there day after day without relief. The wind that accompanied the cold drove the effective temperature even lower, creating conditions that killed livestock in minutes and threatened humans in their own homes. The cast iron stoves of ironwood fought bravely against the cold, but they were fighting a battle they could not win. The fiercer the cold, the faster the heat escaped through walls and windows and every crack in every building. The faster the heat escaped, the more wood the stoves demanded. The more wood they consumed, the faster the stockpiles diminished. By the third day, families were rationing fuel. By the fifth day, they were burning furniture. By the seventh day, the mathematics had become undeniable. There was not enough wood in ironwood to keep every cast iron stove fed until the cold broke. The first death came on the morning of January 18th. Old Silas Hendricks, who lived alone at the edge of the settlement and whose stove had gone cold sometime in the night when his arthritic hands could no longer split kindling, fast enough to keep the fire alive. They would not find him until spring, frozen in his chair with his empty wood box beside him. The crisis had arrived, and Auntie Korhonen's cabin remained warm on 2 fires a day. He could have stayed in his comfort, could have let the people who had laughed at him face the consequences of their mockery. He had tried to teach them, had offered to show them a better way, and they had responded with ridicule. Whatever happened to them was the result of their own choices. But there were children in Ironwood. Children who had never laughed at anyone's stove, who were shivering in cabins where the cast iron could not keep pace with the cold, who might die because their parents had been too proud to learn from a foreigner. Auntie could not let that happen. He walked into Ironwood on the morning of January 19th, fighting through cold that threatened to freeze his lungs with every breath, and he went directly to the Wheeler store where the settlement's leaders had gathered to discuss their dwindling options. "My cabin," he said, his English still accented, but clear enough after 7 years in America. "It is warm. The stove, my stone stove, it heats for 12 hours on one load. I have wood enough for the whole winter. Bring the families, bring the children. There is room." Horace Wheeler stared at him. The man who had led the mockery of the Finnish stove, who had joked about cold stones for 4 winters, now faced the immigrant whose foolishness might be the only thing standing between his community and death. "Your stove," Wheeler said slowly. "The stone one. It actually works?" "It has always worked," Auntie replied. "You never looked." The evacuation began that afternoon. 37 people crowded into Auntie's cabin over the following days. Every family that could not maintain warmth in their own homes. Every person whose wood supply had failed. Every child whose parents had finally accepted that survival mattered more than pride. They brought what fuel they had remaining, adding to Auntie's supply, watching in amazement as he demonstrated the technology they had dismissed for 4 years. The stone stove dominated the cabin, a massive presence that radiated heat from every surface. Auntie fired it twice daily, burning hot and fast for an hour each time, then closing the damper and letting the stone do its work. The heat that emerged was gentle, constant, comfortable, nothing like the fierce blasts from cast iron that burned the skin at close range and left the far corners of a room freezing. "How is this possible?" Martha Wheeler asked on the second night, her hand resting on stone that was warm but not hot, that felt like a sun-heated rock on a summer afternoon, rather than a dangerous surface that could burn. "The fire died hours ago. How is it still warm?" Auntie tried to explain in his imperfect English. "Stone remembers heat," he said. "Iron forgets. Iron gives heat fast, loses fast. Stone holds. Stone gives slow, all night, all day. One fire in morning, one fire in night. Stone does the work between." He gestured at the massive structure. "In Finland, we know this for 500 years, maybe more. We have cold winters too. Our grandfathers learned. Not iron, stone. Stone is patient. Stone keeps you alive." The cold snap lasted 11 days. 11 days during which Auntie's cabin sheltered 37 people, heated by a stove that consumed perhaps 1/5 the fuel that would have been required by cast iron. 11 days during which children slept warm against walls that radiated gentle heat. Elderly couples found comfort they had not felt in weeks, and families who had mocked the Finnish stove discovered what they had been missing. 4 people died in Ironwood during those 11 days, all of them in homes heated by cast iron, all of them victims of a technology that could not keep pace with unprecedented cold. But 37 people who should have joined them survived, sheltered by stone, that held heat like a promise, warmed by a stove that everyone had said would never work. The gathering came in March, when the cold had finally broken and the survivors could assess what had happened. They assembled in the Wheeler store, the only building large enough for the purpose, to acknowledge the winter that had nearly destroyed them and the man who had made the difference. Horace Wheeler spoke first, the merchant who had led the mockery, who had joked about cold stones for 4 winters, who had watched his own family shelter in the cabin he had dismissed as foolish, stood before his community with shame written across his face. 4 years ago, he began, his voice unsteady, I stood in this store and laughed at Auntie Korhonen's stove. I called it a monument to foreign foolishness. I said that Americans knew better than Finnish peasants. I made jokes that this whole settlement repeated, jokes that prevented anyone from taking seriously a technology that could have saved lives. He stopped, struggling to continue. 4 people died this winter. 4 of our neighbors froze in homes heated by cast iron. The American way, the way I insisted was superior. 37 people survived because they sheltered with the Finn I mocked, warmed by the stone stove I said would never work. He looked at Auntie, who stood at the edge of the gathering as he had always stood at the edge of everything, apart, quiet, patient. I was wrong, we were all wrong, and people died because we were too proud to learn from someone who knew better than we did. Martha Wheeler spoke next. The woman who had touched the cold stove and pronounced it useless now wept openly as she confessed. I felt that stone, and I decided it couldn't work because it wasn't hot like cast iron. I never asked why it wasn't hot. I never considered that maybe gentle warmth was better than fierce heat that disappeared the moment the fire died. I knew nothing, and I spoke as if I knew everything. Others spoke. The families who had sheltered in Auntie's cabin, the parents whose children had slept warm against radiating stone, the elderly who had found comfort they had not expected to find again. One by one, they acknowledged what had happened, the mockery, the pride, the deaths that might have been prevented if anyone had been willing to listen. When the testimonies were complete, Auntie walked to the center of the gathering. His English was still accented, his words still chosen carefully, but after 4 years of being dismissed, he finally had an audience willing to hear. In Finland, he said, we have a saying, Kuas pitää muistin. The stove keeps memory. It means the stones remember the heat you give them. They hold it, release it slowly, keep you warm through the long nights. He looked around at the faces of those who had laughed at him. Cast iron has no memory. It gives what you give, takes it back when you stop giving. Stone is different. Stone is patient. Stone works while you sleep, while you read, while you do other things. Stone does not demand all your attention every hour of every day. He paused. I tried to tell you this. You did not listen because I am foreign, because my English is not good, because you believed Americans know better than Finns. Maybe sometimes Americans do know better, but not about cold. We have had cold for 1,000 years. We know cold like you know your own children. He gestured toward his cabin, visible through the store window. The stove is still there. It will last 100 years. Stone does not wear out like iron. I will teach anyone who wants to learn how to build such a stove. The knowledge is not secret. The techniques are not difficult. Anyone with stones and patience can have what I have. He looked at Horace Wheeler. You have lost 4 neighbors. You will not bring them back by learning now. But you can make sure no one else dies because they trusted iron instead of stone. That is the only thing I ask, that you learn and teach your children, so the knowledge passes on. Thank you for watching this story about Auntie Corhonen and the stone stove of ironwood. When we mock what we do not understand, we sometimes lose the wisdom that might save us. If this story reminded you that patience and thermal mass can outperform the latest technology, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Wild West Retribution for more stories of frontier resilience and quiet vindication. Tell us in the comments, has anyone ever dismissed your traditional knowledge until the day they needed exactly what you knew? That summer, 14 stone stoves were built in the Ironwood district, massive structures of granite and limestone, constructed under Auntie's supervision, following techniques that Finnish builders had perfected over centuries. Each stove took weeks to build, but each one would last for generations, radiating heat through winters that would consume any amount of cast iron. Horace Wheeler built one in his own home, dismantling the cast iron stove that had nearly failed his family and replacing it with stone that would never fail again. He never again mocked foreign knowledge, never again assumed that American ways were automatically superior, never again dismissed what he did not understand. The phrase "building Finnish" entered the vocabulary of the Dakota Territory and spread to communities throughout the northern plains. It meant constructing with thermal mass, trusting in patience over intensity, understanding that the old ways sometimes knew things the new ways had forgotten. It was spoken with quiet respect, as if the speaker understood something about heat retention that could only be learned through nearly freezing to death. Auntie Corhonen lived in his cabin for another 43 years, passing in the winter of 1929 at the age of 77. He married in 1890, a widow named Sina, whose first husband had died in the cold snap of '86, one of the four who had trusted cast iron until the end. Together, they raised 3 children, all of whom learned to build stone stoves before they learned to read. The stove he built in 1882 still exists, maintained now by the Dakota Historical Society as a monument to the technology that saved a settlement. Visitors come to feel the gentle warmth, to understand how stone can hold heat for hours after the fire dies, to learn what a Finnish immigrant knew that an entire community refused to believe. Above the firebox, carved in letters that Auntie added in the years after the Great Cold, is an inscription in both Finnish and English. Kivi muistaa, stone remembers. His father, who had taught him to build such stoves in a village half a world away, would have recognized the truth in those words and smiled to know how far the warmth had traveled.